They say revenge is best served cold. But for Charles de la Cruz, it was something born out of grief, planned over years of pain, and finally carried out with sharp precision. This is the story of a man pushed to the edge, a man who became invisible to the world, only to avenge his father's death. Before we dive into today's chilling story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on any shocking true crime cases we uncover. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Carlos de la Cruz was a man of honesty, hard work, and unshakable loyalty to his family. He built his import-export business from the ground up, earning a reputation for being fair and trustworthy. Everyone respected him, his family, employees, and the entire community. But his most important role was being a father to his only son, Charles. Carlos poured his heart into teaching Charles the values he lived by: integrity, patience, and strength. Charles grew up admiring his father, especially his resilience during tough times. Carlos always reminded him that life was about choices and that doing the right thing was always worth it, even when it wasn't the easy path. To Charles, his father wasn't just a parent. He was his hero, his guide, and the one constant in his life. Their bond was built on trust, love, and admiration. But success has its price. Carlos's growing business drew the attention of Miguel "Mick" Rios, a ruthless criminal who saw hardworking people like Carlos as tools for his own gain. Mick and his men demanded payment in exchange for so-called protection. Carlos, true to his principles, refused. One night, Mick and his men decided to teach Carlos a lesson. They wanted to scare him, to break his spirit. But Carlos was fearless, standing firm even in the face of their threats. Enraged by his defiance, Mick ordered his men to attack. The beating was brutal, and they didn't stop until it was too late. Carlos lay lifeless on the cold floor of the warehouse, his courage the only thing left intact. When Charles heard the news of his father's death, his world fell apart. He was only 17, still figuring out life, still growing. His father wasn't just a parent, he was a hero, and now that hero was gone, taken away in a way that made no sense. Grief hit him hard, like a storm he couldn't escape. But grief didn't come alone. It brought something darker with it. Anger. It wasn't just losing his father that hurt. It was the cruel way it happened. Knowing that people had ended his father's life for nothing more than greed and power made Charles burn with a rage he couldn't control. He couldn't stop thinking about his father's face, once full of life and kindness, now gone forever. Night after night, the pain followed him. He made a promise to himself. He would find out who was responsible. One day, he would make them pay. The years that came after were tough. Charles stepped into his father's shoes, taking over the family business. He wanted to keep his father's legacy alive, but it was a heavy weight to carry. Every part of the business reminded him of his dad. Every colleague he met, every document he signed, every client he dealt with, brought back memories of Carlos. Charles wanted to honor his father's teachings, but deep down, his anger grew. It ate away at him, pushing him further from the person he once was. He wasn't just Charles anymore. He had become something else, someone driven by the need to make things right, someone carrying the ghost of his father wherever he went. As Charles grew older, he wasn't the same boy his father had raised. The bright, cheerful son was gone. In his place was a quiet, distant man with a cold look in his eyes. To the world, he was just a hard-working guy running his business, keeping to himself. But inside, he was a storm, angry, restless, and filled with thoughts he couldn't escape. At night, when the world slept, Charles stayed up, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment his father was taken from him. His mind was a maze of plans and ideas, all leading to one thing: finding the men who had destroyed his family. By the time he was in his late 20s, he wasn't the trusting, kind young man anymore. He had changed into someone sharp, focused, and determined. For years, Charles had lived with the pain of his loss, but instead of letting it break him, he turned it into a plan. He spent endless hours piecing together bits of information about the men who had killed his father. Slowly, he built a clear picture of them, where they lived, how they worked, and what they feared. The police had given up on the case long ago. calling it an unsolved tragedy. To them, it was just another file on a shelf. But Charles didn't care about rules or evidence. He didn't need proof. He had his memories and a promise to himself that he wouldn't rest until those men paid for what they did. Quietly, Charles hired investigators to dig into their lives. He studied their every move, when they left home, what they did for work, where they felt safe. Over time, they stopped being strangers to him. They became more than just names. They became his mission. If you're hooked by this story so far, give us a like and leave a comment below telling us what you think about the case. Your thoughts help drive our next investigations, and we love hearing from our true crime community. These men had gone on with their lives, unaware of the fire burning in Charles's heart. But Charles wasn't in a hurry. He had waited for years, and he could wait a little longer. This wasn't just about revenge for him. It was about keeping his promise to the man who had meant the world to him. The group of men who had taken Charles's father from him was a mix of broken souls, each with a troubled past and a part to play in the tragedy. At the center of it all was Mick Rios, the leader, a man whose ambition was as cold as it was boundless. Mick was no stranger to crime. Years behind bars had hardened him, and his greed seemed to grow with every step he took. He had a talent for pulling people into his schemes, using either fear or promises of riches to bend them to his will. His crew was made up of 4 men, each one a story of desperation and bad choices. First, there was Lucas Ortega, tall and thin, with a love for gambling that often left him neck-deep in trouble. Lucas had a serious cocaine habit, and Mick's offer of easy money was all it took to keep him in line. Lucas wasn't just an addict, he was Mick's most trusted man, always there to carry out the more delicate parts of their plans. Then there was Simon Delgado, a man who couldn't seem to sit still. His eyes darted around, always watching, always ready. Simon had a knack for making people feel small, using his sharp tongue and sharp fists to intimidate anyone who stood in their way. His job was simple: scare people into silence or compliance, and he was good at it. Thomas Ruiz was next, a mechanic with a violent past. He had a short fuse and a history of assault, but underneath his tough exterior was a man desperate to escape poverty. Mick promised him a way out, and Thomas latched on, fiercely loyal to the man he saw as his ticket to a better life. Last was José Montoya, the ghost of the group. José was the cleaner, the one who came in after the mess was made and erased every trace. He was quiet, methodical, and impossible to track, a skill that had kept him out of jail and in Mick's good graces for years. Each of these men played a part that fateful night, and together they formed a dark and twisted machine, a single force of destruction. In Charles's eyes, they weren't individuals. They weren't men with families, dreams, or regrets. They were a faceless monster, an embodiment of the evil that had stolen his father away. For Charles, their sins had stripped them of any claim to forgiveness. In his heart, they had already been judged, and mercy wasn't part of the sentence. Lucas Ortega was the weakest link among the 5 men. He was a wreck, a cocaine addict and a gambler whose habits made him easy to track. He lived on the edge, repeating the same routine day after day, and Charles had spent weeks silently studying him. Watching from a distance, Charles pieced together Lucas's life, the bars he visited, the people he owed money to, and the desperate way he clung to his addictions. Charles wasn't in a rush. He was waiting for the perfect moment. It came on a cold, foggy night, the kind where the world feels like it's holding its breath. Lucas stumbled out of a dimly lit bar, drunk and completely unaware of the shadow following him. Charles stayed close but out of sight, his heart steady, his mind focused. Lucas weaved through the streets, mumbling to himself, and turned into a dark, narrow alley behind the bar. That was when Charles made his move. He approached without a sound, his steps calculated and sure. Lucas didn't even realize someone was there until it was too late. In one quick motion, Charles had him pinned against the wall, his hands gripping Lucas's throat. The addict's eyes widened in fear, his breath turning into panicked gasps. "You remember Carlos de la Cruz?" Charles said in a low, steady voice. His words weren't loud, but they cut through the cold night like a blade. Lucas's face twisted in confusion and terror. He tried to speak, to beg, but the words came out as choking noises. Charles didn't care. He wasn't here for a conversation. With a sharp, deliberate motion, he ended Lucas's life. The struggle stopped, and silence filled the alley once more. For a moment, Charles just stood there, staring at the lifeless body in his hands. He felt calm. Not joy, not satisfaction, just a strange, eerie calm. It was done. The first step toward avenging his father was complete. He laid Lucas's body on the ground, carefully erasing any evidence that might lead back to him. Charles wasn't reckless. He had spent hours reading about how investigators worked, learning how to leave no traces. By the time he was finished, the alley was quiet again, as though nothing had happened. When the police would eventually find Lucas Ortega, they'd see another dead addict in the wrong place at the wrong time. To them, it would be a dead end. To Charles, it was the beginning of something far bigger. Simon Delgado was a man who lived off making others scared. His reputation for bullying people was as strong as the walls of his big house. He was tall and built like a wall, always showing up with a group of bodyguards, each one picked because they were tough and loyal. People talked behind his back about how ruthless he was and how he controlled everything in the shady world he lived in. Simon loved it. Fear was his power, and he used it whenever he could. Charles, though, was a different kind of person. He wasn't showy or loud. He didn't rely on being scary or having muscle. What he had was patience, and he used it well. For weeks, he kept a close eye on Simon, watching his every move, figuring out when he would be vulnerable. Charles wasn't in any rush. He knew that a time would come when Simon would let his guard down. That moment came one quiet evening. Simon had just wrapped up a big deal and decided he didn't need his bodyguards for the night. He sat by himself in his large living room, sipping on whiskey, the soft light casting shadows around him. For once, the house felt empty and unprotected. Charles moved in quietly, taking advantage of Simon's carelessness. He knew all the weak spots, the places where the security wasn't as tight. By the time Simon realized someone was there, it was already too late. There was no need for any words. Charles's look told Simon everything he needed to know. It was cold and steady, and Simon instantly understood that he was facing his end. Even with all his toughness, Simon couldn't shake the feeling of fear, something his bodyguards couldn't protect him from. Charles didn't waste any time. He acted fast, with the precision of someone who had done this before. It was over quickly, no noise, no mess, just silence. By the time anyone called the police, Charles was long gone. He disappeared into the night, like a shadow, leaving nothing behind. Simon, the man who had lived by making others afraid, had met his end without seeing it coming, and life carried on without anyone knowing who was behind it. Thomas Ruiz wasn't like the others. He was different, a mechanic by trade, but his past was filled with violence and survival. Tomas was tough, no stranger to street fights and gritty situations. He had learned early on that in this world, you either fight or you don't make it. Tomas knew he couldn't just walk in and take him on directly. Tomas wasn't someone you could defeat with a simple confrontation. He had too much pride, too much arrogance, and Charles was smart enough to realize that. Instead of going in full force, Charles decided to use Tomas's pride against him. He put on a disguise, something simple, just a mechanic looking for a job. He wasn't in a rush, so he spent weeks working side by side with Tomas, slowly earning his trust. Day by day, he blended in with the crew, showing his own skills and understanding of the trade. Tomas was no fool. He noticed Charles's expertise, and little by little, he started to warm up to him. Charles kept his head down, waiting for the right moment. He knew patience was key. Tomas, with all his toughness, had his weaknesses, and Charles just had to be patient enough to find them. Charles turned to it. Then came the moment. One day, when Tomas was alone in the shop, Charles finally revealed who he really was. He didn't hide anymore. He stepped out of the shadows, looked Tomas in the eye, and let him see the man who had come to end his life. Tomas, full of rage and pride, didn't back down. He fought with everything he had, his fists flying, but Charles was ready. He knew exactly what to expect. He was watching him. The struggle was fierce. Tomas's strength was raw and brutal, but Charles had something else: strategy, control, and the element of surprise. In the end, After a brutal fight that seemed to last forever, it was clear who was in charge. Tomás, the man who had lived by the fight, lay motionless on the floor, his life slipping away. Charles stood over him, breathing heavily, looking down at the man who had been so sure of his own invincibility, but now it was all over. Tomás was just another name on a long list of people who had underestimated Charles. José Montoya was a man who always stayed one step ahead. He had a way of keeping to the shadows, constantly aware of his surroundings. People who did what he did didn't get to live careless lives, and he'd built a reputation for being slippery, always keeping an eye out for anyone who might be watching. Charles, however, knew that he'd eventually get his shot. He had to be patient. For months, Charles tracked José, moving from one city to another, keeping his distance but never losing sight of his target. He knew the only way to catch someone like José was to wait for him to slip up. It wasn't until they both ended up in a quiet, isolated town that Charles saw his chance. The hustle and bustle of the cities had worn down on José's sharp instincts. He was careless here, and that's exactly what Charles needed. One evening, in an isolated part of town, far from the crowded streets and nosy onlookers, Charles finally made his move. He approached José when he least expected it, in a place where no one would hear anything, no one would care. José, realizing too late that he had been cornered, tried to flee. But Charles was quicker, more determined. He had been chasing this moment for too long to let it slip away now. The chase didn't last long. It was clear from the way José moved that his desperation was no match for Charles's relentless pursuit. When it was all over, José was left with no way out. Charles did what he had done before. He made sure the job was finished. José's end was swift and quiet, the kind of justice that didn't leave a mark. When it was over, Charles didn't look back. His mission was almost complete. He felt a strange calm wash over him as he walked away, knowing the hardest part was behind him. Mick Rios was the man behind it all, the one who had arranged for Charles's father to be killed. Charles had been waiting for this moment, saving Mick for last because he wanted to make sure Mick understood exactly why he was about to pay the price. Finding Mick had been no easy task. He had gone into hiding under a fake name, living in a secluded spot far from the reach of the law. Mick was careful, surrounded by layers of security, and completely cut off from the rest of the world. But Charles wasn't going to give up. He had already come so far, and there was no way he was going to stop now. Charles decided to take a chance and disguise himself as a repairman. It was a risky move, but it worked. He managed to slip past Mick's security, one step at a time, until he finally reached the place where Mick was hiding. He wasn't going to give Mick a chance to escape. Charles made his way to Mick's private quarters, quietly making sure he was alone before revealing who he was. As Mick was to become quite old, he was probably indisposable, and he rarely reaved anymore. "Do you remember Carlos de la Cruz?" Charles asked, his voice steady, but with an unmistakable coldness in it. Mick's face turned pale, his eyes widening in shock as the realization hit him. He knew exactly who stood in front of him now. Mick tried to fight back, tried to beg for mercy, but it was no use. Charles wasn't interested in his pleas. This wasn't about mercy. This was about making sure Mick understood the weight of his actions. With each movement, Charles made sure to draw out the moment, taking his time to make Mick feel every second of the vengeance that had been a long time coming. In the end, Mick's life came to an end, slow and painful, as Charles watched him struggle. It was the final chapter of the revenge that had started so many years ago, the end of the man responsible for taking away the one person Charles had loved most. After completing what he had set out to do, Charles knew it was time to disappear. He couldn't stay. He had to leave everything behind and erase the person he had been. So, he had prepared for this moment for a long time. He'd created a new life for himself. New papers, a fake name, everything he needed to start fresh. He chose Argentina, a place where he could blend in, where no one would know him, and where he could vanish completely. In Argentina, he started over, He became a different person, burying his old memories so deep that even he couldn't reach them anymore. The man who had once been Charles de la Cruz was gone, replaced by someone nobody would ever notice or remember. He lived quietly, staying in the shadows, careful not to attract attention. Years went by, and the 5 murders Charles had committed remained unsolved. No one had a clue who was behind them. There wasn't a single piece of evidence to point to him. Charles had been smart about it. He covered his tracks perfectly. No fingerprints, no witnesses, nothing. In Argentina, he lived a new life, a ghost in the crowd, a man who had taken revenge for his father and then disappeared into the world. But the story of Charles de la Cruz slowly faded into whispers, a legend of a son who had gotten revenge in the harshest way possible. But in his heart, Charles knew he had done what needed to be done. He had honored his father's memory. The justice he sought had been served, and now he could live in peace, without a past, without an identity, and without regret. The tale of Charles de la Cruz is a haunting one. It reminds us that the search for justice can sometimes lead down a dark and painful road. It's a story about loss, vengeance, and the toll that grief can take on the soul. Some might call him a monster for what he did, but others might understand him as a man pushed to the limit. In his own way, Charles was trying to find closure, to make peace with a world that had taken everything from him. Thanks for staying with us until the end. If you're fascinated by this case, make sure to subscribe for more mind-blowing true crime stories and updates. And don't forget to like and share this video with a friend who loves a good mystery. Let's get the word out together.